morning, everyone. It's a pleasure for me to be here.
Presentation in English. And as you could imagine, we are in a very difficult moment, and the world is actually going through incredible changes that are going to reflect a very different moment for all of us. So I think it's important to take stock of what has been the growth pattern over the last few years. And we have more or less stabilized around 3.1% of growth. And this has been despite different types of shocks that you are aware of. We had the first 2008-2009 financial crisis, then we had the pandemic and the repercussions of different wars that ensued. But overall, we have much more impact from the changes that are occurring in China because the demand and its contribution for growth was quite significant. But we have also other characteristics that you are very familiar with that have contributed to us being under the perception that things were not going that well, and in fact there are lots of problems. But overall, the growth pattern has been stable. What is fascinating, though, is to understand what has been the contribution of Africa for that growth pattern. And what we realize is that, despite the fact that emerging economies have contributed much more than high-income economies, most of it was coming from Asia. And what we are seeing in terms of percentage, obviously not value, is that Africa is approaching Asia patterns, and in fact, it's very much in the trajectory of surpassing Asia overall growth. And this is something that normally we don't underline enough, we don't talk enough, and it's precisely for that reason that I wanted to demonstrate to you first that this is coming from different parts of the continent. It's a trajectory that is more or less shared across the continent. But more importantly, this 4.1% growth, according to the outlooks, is going to be consolidating in 2025. And we can say that 10 out of the 20 fastest growing economies are going to be African, which is quite a remarkable performance. Now, obviously, people will immediately say, what is the flip side? And when we look into the flip side, we know that there has been huge pressure on debt. That creates enormous problems, not to mention the ones that have already been referred in the previous panel. But what is fascinating for me is that despite all the shocks that we have witnessed, this increase in sovereign debt has not been that significant in relation to expectations. In fact, it has gone from about 50% debt to GDP ratio to about 60%. But nevertheless, the pressure on debt servicing is increasing quite significantly in a number of countries. And obviously, together with other very important macro tendency, which is inflation, it's creating huge problems for the poor. And it's obliging countries to choose between investing in different types of transformative processes and actually attending to social needs that are increasing thanks to all the various crises. And I would say that this resilience of Africa, to a certain extent, is not really captured by international players. If you look into the cost of capital, this has been referred from a previous panel, you can see that Africa really pays a premium that is quite high, and you wouldn't expect that such a situation will continue to prevail when you look into what is the default rates, the real default rates, not the ones that are in the imagination, but the ones that are actually accounted for, where Africa has the lowest default rates. So we should have been compensated to a certain degree for this behavior. And this is precisely because the projects that in Africa are important and significant in terms of value are also the subject of so much precautionary measures. And the treatment and the processing of these big infrastructure projects in particular is so complex that it takes an inordinate amount of time. But, you know, the good news is that they compensate in terms of default rates being so low. And obviously, you have also the issues that have been mentioned about potential, particularly when you look at all the transitions that are going to depend to a large extent on climate, and you look into what has been really the renewable energy investment globally, and you look into Africa, just as an illustration of how Africa has been diminished in terms of its potential, you can see that what is coming to the continent is quite peanuts. And this is obviously not in relation to the reality. The reality is that the global allocations for climate are going to be probably propelled to a certain degree. But if you look into where they are coming from, people keep referring in terms of the reforms of the financial system that we are going to increase the allocation of SDRs as just one demonstration of goodwill towards Africa. But I would like to mention to you that all of that is going to be quite poor in terms of the needs, and it's going to be quite mediocre in terms of processes, because most of this money, as you can see in different data, is going to mitigation efforts rather than for adaptation, which is our number one difficulty in relation to climate, and the one that we can contribute the most in terms of the transitions that are needed. So if you look into how we define a robust, autonomous path to deal with the issues that I just mentioned, we can look into where the flows are coming in terms of the current situation and where we have possibilities for increasing. I like to mention, and it's just an anecdote that I think is quite significant nowadays because it's in the news in a different way, is that Tesla, that has a valuation of 1.2 trillion, run a deficit from its foundation in 2007 until 2020. So that deficit, a cumulative deficit, year after year, didn't scare the investors. Didn't scare the investors because they were looking into the potential and they were looking into the possibilities. But they were also looking into how these different types of companies have inbuilt a system of protection for their difficulties. And this is exactly an example for Africa, because if you look into Africa potential in relation to Tesla potential, in terms of global numbers, we are talking about the size not being necessarily the same, but pretty close. And you would really imagine how come, the discussion nowadays is about the CEO of Tesla being allowed or not to have a salary of $54 billion a year. And we are looking into capital increases in Africa, including SDR allocation, that is going to be in the order of about 20 billion. So this gives you an idea that we are not talking yet about scale. And the savings of institutional funds in Africa is probably the right answer, because the $1 trillion funds that exist in our pension funds, or even the market capitalization of the Johannesburg Stock Exchange, that is 2.3 trillion, is where we should look into possibilities for Africa. Africa's money is not yet being tapped in the dimension that it requires. And we look into Africa's believing in Africa. Somehow the good example is coming from the diaspora that is increasing its remittances, now attaining $95 billion, which is more or less twice what we receive in terms of aid and concessional lending. And we need also to look into how the multilateral development banks in Africa are going to play a much more critical role than they are already playing, because when you look into their capitalization, it represents about 1% only of the multilateral development banks of the world. So the Africans are really a tiny, tiny proportion of the total. And we need also, obviously, to enhance the possibilities for sovereign lending and sovereign borrowing to be done in local currencies, because it creates the protection, but also it increases our banking sector role that is extremely important. So most of the money that we are now seeing coming from concessional lending would have a multiplier effect, but also a protective effect if it was actually distributed via our African banks that would be able to then lend to sovereigns. And of course, we have to look into the green bonds. It was mentioned before, but I want to alert you that the green bonds have been so far really tiny in Africa, but more importantly, it has been mostly to compensate for others to continue their trajectory of punishing the planet. If we want the green bonds to really work for Africa, it should not be about just investing in our protective areas. It should be much more focused on strategic dimensions that I'm going to mention in a minute. And of course, you have also to look into how we increase financial inclusion. This has been already mentioned. So what could be the call of action? Before we actually look into the call of action, we need to just pause and understand that the climate discussion is going to be not a passage, it's not going to be an afterthought, it's going to be central in the way we are dismantling the current economic system to introduce new forms of protection, to introduce new forms of intellectual property that is going to implode the current regimes, thanks to artificial intelligence, to include new forms of logistics. All of it is going to be affected by climate. And when we look into how we are basically dealing with climate right now, in Africa, we are basically dealing with mitigation. And we have, you have heard it, not contributed more than 4% of the climate problem. But we continue to deal with mitigation as if it was provoked by us. So we need to shift the gears, and we need to make sure that we have, for this call of action, a different type of priorities. So to conclude, I think we have to first realize that the time of ODA, or if you want, aid, and the centrality of aid and concessional lending is coming to an end. It doesn't mean it's going to disappear, but it's going to be much less important than it is already. And today, it's already much less important than it was just 20 years ago. So we are in a trajectory where ODA and concessional lending is going to diminish, not increase, in relation to the needs, in relation to the size of the Africa GDP. Second, we need to expand the mechanisms, the innovative mechanisms that we have introduced for debt swaps, but we have to focus them in the transformation of Africa, and particularly green industrialization of Africa. I was very touched by a study that has been done recently by the African Development Bank that centers precisely not just on the potential for green industrialization in the continent, but about all the different elements that we have in terms of assets that have not been properly valued, and they try to value them as a way of dealing with the discomfort that certain investors may have on this type of transformation. And obviously, industrialization only happens when you have incredible policy coherence and innovation. And we are seeing that popping up in many African countries, and more interested in different types of initiatives that are propelling industrialization. I remain very convicted that this is the way to go. We have to push for equitable representation in different fora of decision. Here, we normally mention Bretton Woods institutions for obvious reasons, but I think it's equally important for us to bear in mind that the Bank of International Settlements is creating some of the rules that may contribute to the consolidation of the banking sector, may contribute to prudential rules being a bit more robust, but is also creating the risk and the difficulties of new entrants that is provoking the desertion of Africa by international banks. Obviously, this is also a challenge and an opportunity for the African banks. And of course, we have to advocate for the SDR reallocation as planned in different reports for the reform of the IMF in particular. They talk about something like 50 billion, but we have to bear in mind that these amounts are not going to be significant in relation to the needs, but they can be significant if they are used to propel the African banking sector. And this is where we have to put the emphasis more than in the numbers alone. And last but not least, we need much more regional collaboration. We need reforms that are going to touch the credit rating agencies' behavior. We cannot continue to accept that countries' sovereign rating is used for every single activity in a given jurisdiction, because this is not the behavior that you apply in other parts of the world, and is the most punitive action that is contributing for the creating of the wrong risk perceptions on the continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Merci infiniment, Professeur Carlos Lopes.
Thank you very much, Professor Carlos Lopes. We are here now with my dear friend. Thank you for remaining here and with presence of all those specialists and experts. Yes, as we said, the future is now, and we will now continue the exchange out here to the right. We invite you to use the app, which is available on the Apple Store, and we wish you amazing meetings. Thank you.